Briefly, I'm Mike Boninger. I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh and one of the co-PIs on the ART grant that is bringing these presentations together. We are honored and thrilled to have Dr. Wheaton give his presentation today. I'll do a brief introduction and then we'll start. We'll have a question and answer period, and then for a lucky set of junior faculty, there'll be a Meet the Mentor session after that. Dr. Wheaton got his PhD in neuroscience and cognitive science from the University of Maryland, and then was a fellow at the National Institutes of Health in the medical neurology branch. He is currently an associate professor in the School of Biological Sciences at Georgia Tech, and also an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Rehabilitation at Emory School of Medicine. Importantly, he directs the Cognitive Motor Control Laboratory at Georgia Tech and seeks to understand neurophysiology guiding skillful human-object interaction and upper extremity motor control. I had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Wheaton as part of a mentorship grant that I have through NIH, where we're trying to teach physicians how to become NIH-funded investigators. And I'm not sure we've ever had a mentor who got as high ratings after his first year as a mentor in the program as Dr. Wheaton. And so I can speak to his individual mentorship. We really try to get great speakers for this series. So I wanted to just check out whether from one other source about his ability to do two things, that is give a great talk, not to put pressure on you, Lewis, but and also to connect the dots, because regenerative rehabilitation is about connecting these dots between these two fields. So I emailed a former postdoc that worked in my lab, who happened to be Bill Kuzak, who happened to be Dr. Wheaton's first doctoral student at Georgia Tech. I think a further testament to Dr. Wheaton is that he had nothing but positive things to say, and we all know that that PhD relationship can get complex at times. He said he was a great speaker, and that connecting different dots from unique fields was a strength of his, a particular strength, and went into a short story about behavioral anthropology at Emory and a wonderful project, it sounds like, that the two worked on together. So without taking any more time, I'm just thrilled to have you with us, Lewis, and excited to hear your talk.
Thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate that. It's always nice to hear kind things said about you, particularly from a former student. And I feel like I have a lot to live up to now. So, but thank you for that, for sure. And I'm very excited as well to be able to meet you all in this format. Sadly, we can't be together, but hopefully we can have some good virtual communication here. So hopefully I'll be able to get this started pretty well. Important question. I'm going to assume everyone can see the PowerPoint slides.
We can see it perfectly.
Perfect, wonderful. All right, my one concern is over. So today we're going to be talking about some of the work in the lab where we're looking at the intersection of motor learning and sensation for the purposes of neurorehabilitation and restoration. From the disclosure side of the fence, I have none. I take great pride in being very boring when it comes to that. So as far as the talk objectives, we will kind of go through a little bit of how motor learning has been studied to understand neuroplasticity, and also principles of how sensory systems may be harnessed to influence neuroplasticity, and then maybe think about how these can work in motor outcomes. I think it's well known now that there's been a lot of work in trying to really address learning how to move. Classic neuroscience work has utilized various very basic paradigms, very complicated paradigms, to understand motor learning processes, whether in pediatric populations, and adult populations, and throughout aging. And also, we've done a good job in developing models. Here is sort of one of those models that tries to approach things based on vision-centered processes and motor-centered processes as well, and how those interact to develop motor skills. Some of our work as well has looked at the neural correlates of that behavior to be able to hopefully appreciate how these neural networks that we have proposed in some of our previous work go to help support motor learning and motor behavior. But as well on the side of really relearning how to move is one of the things that is obviously a concern with neural injury in particular, and as well in the developmental aspects. In my particular area of interest, particularly over the last roughly 10 years, has really been getting interested in upper limb amputation specifically, and that's what we'll be spending our time talking about today. Uniquely, upper limb amputation immediately causes a rapid change in body form, right? So we're not just talking about, and I don't mean just in a trivial sense, we're not just talking about injury to the nervous system, such as a stroke or multiple sclerosis or things like that, which are obviously tremendous concerns. But we're additionally talking about the loss of a limb, loss of sensory and motor axons within that body part, and all kinds of known and even unknown neuroplastic changes that are happening rather quickly. And this is an immediate loss, and particularly on the sensory side, it's immediate loss of sensation from the missing limb, and uniquely one that just won't ever come back. Prostheses in the upper limb really hope to return some function of motor control. They have been designed historically, probably by evolution, have kind of really focused on providing morphometric balance to the individual that has particularly a unilateral upper limb amputation, and also potentially to provide some sort of sensation to the user. This is probably one of the more complicated parts of this because that sensation can either come from the prosthesis itself, or it can kind of come from other sources as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit here in a moment. Uniquely, upper limb amputation has a fascinating trajectory. In the most optimistic case, these are the kind of four phases that often are considered to be important for upper limb amputation rehabilitation. And if you notice just quickly through this figure here, the first, probably realistically several months after the amputation, have nothing to do with really using the device. Most of the time is spent on, let's say, rebuilding or building the injured limb, pushing through some basic things before you can actually be fit with the prosthesis. So really spending a good bit of time on motor adaptation. So learning how to live life without the amputated limb. And then fascinating, we put that prosthetic on the person and now try to teach them how to relearn being bimanual in the case of a unilateral amputee. Also, these phases and times are incredibly optimistic. They depend heavily on having good integrity in the earliest phases of amputation. And most often, a lot of persons with upper limb loss go through multiple surgeries for repair. So the time to fitting with a prosthesis can be months down the line. And this has been a concern because for most prosthesis users, many of them are moderate to low users of their prostheses in daily life. There have been probably many, many, many years of surveys that have looked at this, and they all kind of come to about the same thing. For most activities of daily living, upper limb amputees, particularly that are unilateral, very almost at a 50-50 level may or may not use their prosthetic limb. And for those daily tasks that more commonly do at the 70% mark, it's almost out of necessity because they are highly bilateral. So I really don't have any choice but to use their prosthetic limb. As well, I always like to point out, note to the variability around these means is quite high. And these are just for the non-rejectors. The people that have decided to wear a prosthetic limb, most people, depending on the study, most people actually still choose not to wear a prosthetic limb, in the upper limb in particular. And so this kind of brings forth several areas of research over the years, whether it's looking at the neurobiology and the plasticity, looking at neuroprosthetics, which obviously gets a lot of attention, and also looking at the limb prosthetic interface. How can we maximize the interface between the body and the technology to improve function? And so most of my work is really focused on the motor learning and the training aspects to look at rehabilitation therapy and try to understand, what can we leverage, so to speak, in amputees uniquely to help facilitate motor control. So just as a demonstration, this is a small part of just a video of a study that was done by one of my grad students who is a prosthetist, Laura Huey, demonstrating something very basic. This is a training task that we had a group of participants take part of, and what you're seeing is just the training phase of the task. And you're going to see three individuals perform this task. The first is somebody with a sound limb. The second is somebody with sound limbs that's wearing a simulator of a prosthetic limb. And the third is somebody that's an actual amputee. And you'll note here the difficulty that the person has in actually performing the task. So here is our person using the simulator. They've only had this on for a total of about 10 minutes, and they're struggling with it. Here's an amputee of 6 years performing the same task. He's had his device for several years and has great difficulty in actually performing the basic aspects of this task. And so what's interesting here is that, these prostheses are very difficult to use. Even for somebody that is deep into chronicity, is having struggle really understanding how to use the devices. And so a common concern here is let's reestablish sensation. And several studies have looked at this, trying to reestablish sensation, and that has often been addressed, but sometimes with kind of modest benefit, unfortunately. At least in the human population. So this is not necessarily universal, but what I want to focus attention on here is in this particular study, the use of torque feedback or vibrotactile feedback or no feedback, in this case, in healthy subjects using a prosthesis simulator, didn't necessarily change their grip force or their variability. However, in persons with a limb loss, there was some significant effect. But from the paper suggests there was really an inconclusive effect of referred haptic feedback in these individuals, which suggests the need for additional training for participants to see if you can maximize this feedback. And part of those results came from these odds ratio tests that they did, which really just kind of discovered that there wasn't necessarily a clear benefit of whether it was torque feedback or vibrotactile feedback for prostheses. And so we were curious about this, and one of my grad students, John Johnson, has been trying to tackle this in a couple different paradigms. I'll just illustrate one quick example of this. Looking at people trying to learn how to use a prosthesis that are either start off using the prosthesis without feedback and then transition to vibrotactile feedback, or they start with vibrotactile feedback and then we take it away. And then we have another group of people use tongs, salad tongs basically, with their hands in order to do a very simple motor task. And that simple motor task is to start at this home button here, reach and grasp any number of 3 discs, and move those discs to another destination and return home. Very simple motor task in this case. And so they repeat this task over and over again. And a kind of important part of that task is the fact that the discs are different sizes. And so we're kind of trying to see here whether or not the timing of the onset of the vibrotactile feedback, so when they receive that feedback relative to the operation of the prosthesis, does this infer any benefit to them as they're performing the task? And so this is just a quick example of one of these tasks where we look at, their velocity. We can look at the aperture of the actually opening and the closing of the prosthetic limb as they're reaching to pick up the discs here. And what we also see is if we were to look at the motor control as a percentage of the actual task in each one of the four groups here, so those that start without vibrotactile feedback and follow with vibrotactile feedback or do the exact opposite. In this case, if we look at it as a percentage of their task performance, their grasp begin time, their aperture peak time, their transport begin, peak velocity, and transport end are all about the same. It doesn't seemingly affect the percent of the phase in which the movement occurs. But as well, when we did look at grasp aperture, we noted that whether or not there was vibrotactile feedback or somebody was using the salad tongs in order to do this same task, the grasp aperture really wasn't dramatically affected, particularly with the feedback versus vibrotactile feedback. So they reach and grasp the disc and they maintain about the same size aperture in each case. As well, when we look at the actual kinematics of the reach to grasp, so we're looking at their velocity as a percent of their movement for the two prosthesis groups in green and blue. You see this really sharp increase in velocity of their movement, but they basically become the same during the reach to grasp phase, which is a little bit unique from the more kind of bell-shaped curve of the salad tongs users when they're doing it with their hand. And as well, the transport seemingly is unaffected. Interestingly enough, it seems like no feedback actually helps you move faster than having the vibrotactile feedback. And this is important because this is while you're grasping the disc, and so you're receiving that vibrotactile feedback as you're moving the disc. And so it seems like with vibrotactile feedback, they actually move slower than they do with feedback. We've repeated this over single sessions. We've done this over a week, and have basically seen similar results, whether in acute phase or maybe even the chronic phase. We don't really see a major effect of this. And so similar to some other studies that have explored this at a very low level in humans, the feedback doesn't necessarily lead to massive improvements in prosthesis use, and particularly ones that are maximally different from just practice-based effects with non-actuated prostheses. And that really kind of made us scratch our heads. There could be a long-term benefit. There seemingly is a neuroplastic benefit, and I won't go into that today, but there's this dissociation perhaps of the neural benefits of vibrotactile feedback, but those neural benefits don't convey necessarily into motor improvements that we can discern on any level. And so we're still exploring what that means, but this has pushed us into work that we really got excited about, looking actually at a different type of sensory feedback. And that's probably the one that is the one that we often overlook in some of these studies, and that's how the visual system might play a role. So speaking of Bill Cusack, Bill came to me one day several years into his PhD and asked a very good question. And his question was, why don't, after going to some clinics and really learning how therapy works in upper limb loss, he said, well, why on earth would a therapist show someone how to use a prosthetic limb that doesn't have a prosthetic limb? It's almost like an experience-based mechanism. It's kind of analogous to if somebody was out there doing some particular installation of some sort of device, and I'm watching them and I have no clue what they're doing. I have no clue what I'm seeing. Well, how on earth can I emulate what they're able to do with any level of success? And so what he proposed, working with another grad student and another student in our MSPO program, Delisa Lawson, proposed was, well, let's compare the standard where somebody without a prosthetic limb is showing you how to use a prosthetic device versus somebody that does have a prosthetic limb showing you how to use the device. And I'll show you here in the video, kind of, these are the videos that we show. This is just one of the actions. The clicking sound you hear is a metronome in the background that keeps the timing of this movement. So it's pretty regular. So it's very simple, very boring, very simple task. Compare it to a prosthesis user doing the exact same thing. Right, so the movement is the same, the goal is the same. The only thing that's different is very subtle differences in the kinematics of what the user is actually doing. And so Bill wanted to dig deeper into this and say, okay, what are the participants seeing from a kinematic point of view? And what he showed was that, yes, for the intact actor and the prosthesis actors, the kinematics are very different. For the prosthesis actor, there's a whole lot more shoulder adduction in the task, so bringing the shoulder in to compensate for the fact that you can't rotate your forearm to do the rotation. As well, the elbow, in this case, tends to be a bit more extended in the intact actor as opposed to more flexed in the prosthesis actor. And so we wanted to know, how does this compare with what our prosthesis users are actually doing? And at the shoulder, they both display the same thing. Again, this is the only way you can rotate the block, is kind of by bringing the shoulder closer to the midline of the body. But the elbow flexion almost mirrors, not in magnitude, but in direction, what's happening with the participant. And again, they're not really cued to anything. We didn't tell the participants to look at any particular thing. We just wanted to see what they would do. And these patterns kind of organically happen. As well, we looked at what are referred to kind of these angle plots, where we look at the correlation between what's happening at the shoulder and at the elbow. And we see here for the intact in gray and the prosthesis actor in black, kind of just different, if you can almost imagine slopes, right? So just different slopes of direction of these angle plots. This is what the participant sees in the person that they're mimicking and doing the task. And this is what participants do. Those slopes are in the exact same direction. And so this really had us scratching our heads thinking, wow, what is happening here? Why is it the case that if you're watching somebody that's a prosthesis user perform this task, that you're so easily able to almost adapt behavior to be just like the video you're watching? How is that happening, and is that good? Those are two separate questions. So to tackle the how is this happening, we wanted to look at a kind of the more obvious point here, is what's the role of the visual system in all of this? And so what we did was we wanted to understand this from an eye tracking point of view. And so we had participants that were learning how to use a prosthetic limb. In this case, these were healthy participants that were wearing a prosthesis simulator. And they were learning how to do this particular task where they're just moving a disc from one side over this barrier that's about 24 centimeters high. That's important in a moment. And they're bringing it over to this side, okay? And so they do this in the mismatched and the matched case. And all the users were wearing a prosthesis that looked very similar to this. And so we did this across 3 sessions, very short period of observation, and then performing some number of movements. We'll repeat this over 3 blocks. The eye tracking analysis focused on particular areas of maximal interest. One is the shoulders. In order to use this prosthesis, it forces you to do a flexion movement at the biscapular flexion in order to actually hold the disc within the device. So it's a very difficult thing, but you have to pick up some visual cues from the shoulders to actually perform it. We also wanted to see, since the path of the action goes over this barrier, we wanted to also look at that exact path point. And then we also wanted to see what happens if people actually go directly back and forth between the two. So if they were just starting at one point and they were just looking at the home point, for example. And the most direct line to do that is this lower visual field. And so indeed, this is kind of an average of all the participants, their gaze patterns. And what we see is for the matched group, when they're watching these videos and we're looking at their eye tracking results, their gaze goes over that barrier to the home base. So it's basically following the kinematic path of the action. And as well, they spend a lot more time looking at the participants' shoulders here. They're totally obscured by the blue, but the person they're looking at in the action, they're looking at their shoulders to perform the task. However, when you're mismatched, your eyes basically just go back and forth between the start and the end points of the exact action. And so this made us wonder, okay, well, that's the gaze, that's interesting, but what's the behavior like in this case? And so I'll highlight a couple things. One, the lateral trunk movement, which was for the match group, which is in black, got progressively lower over the course of the movement. So they're wasting a little bit less movement by lateral trunk movement versus the mismatched group, which does decrease, but not as rapidly as well. The matched limb group actually increases their velocity quite dramatically, whereas the mismatched group starts off fairly high and then actually dips down a bit. This is a little bit ambiguous, and we think there is actually a story here that I can expand on later on. But what was fascinating to us particularly was the peak height movement. I told you that barrier was about 24 centimeters off the ground, off from the platform edge. What we see here is that by trial 3, the match group is actually able to pull that within about 3.5 centimeters of the barricade distance. And a lot of our match group users did say that they felt much more confident in performing the task, and thus they weren't trying to go way over the barrier, but they were comfortable to just go over top of that barrier in order to perform the action. We published this result and we wanted to dig deeper into this. And this is kind of ongoing work. We're writing up the first phase of this analysis now, but what we're trying to understand is what are the kinematic correlates between the eye movement and the limb movement that might infer what's going on. And so this is just a figure here to demonstrate what we're doing. What we take is data from the kinematic domain, let's say, and data from the eye tracking domain, let's say, and develop a model where we can correlate the two and understand which kinematic data out of all the kinematic variables we may be interested in may explain the correlations better, and likewise do the same thing for the eye tracking results. One of my favorite figures of this whole thing is here, pandemic-based analysis, where one of my former grad students is working with one of my present grad students, and we're kind of plowing through the code and making sure all the code is right in order to actually do this work. I just love what we're able to do with technology these days. But what we're able to see is, yes, we can get some sort of interesting relationships out of this using this canonical correlation analysis. And I'm not going to go into the depths of this. This is just a lot, and I know this, but there's one point that really caught our eye when we were pulling back from this analysis, because one of the things that this can do is can reveal to us which variables are most critical. One of the variable sets that was incredibly critical was the fact that visual gaze on the shoulders in particular was fascinating. So if there was the higher the probability that gaze spent on the shoulders for the match group indicated a higher peak velocity. We also see this with better movement smoothness. We see this with better accuracy of movement as well, compared to the mismatch group where there is absolutely no correlation at all, a P of 0.75. And so this is actually very encouraging, and we're building on this actually to develop more of a predictive model of what this could look like in real time. Can we identify people that are maybe paying attention or not paying attention to the kinematics that are going on in this, and how do we cue people if they're not paying attention to these visual cues? And so one of the things that really kind of brought this story a little bit home for us, and we're at I feel like we're very much at the edge of understanding what may be going on, is wondering whether or not the visual system is actually positioned to support this kind of sensory motor learning following upper limb loss? Is it actually uniquely positioned to do this? And one of the things that we did, and this is actually, I tell this story, I'm not going to tell it here because it's a very long story. If somebody asks about it, that's fine. But this is a tremendous story to me of how a project can evolve from data that we have no clue what we're looking at to something that may be meaningful down the line. So two of my grad students several years ago were really trying to understand, while we were discovering these matched limb benefit effects, well, is there anything neurally that tells us why this is going on? Bill Cusack had done some work demonstrating this is a possibility in a cohort of amputees, work that I haven't showed. But in the meantime, we were doing this study to understand really what are the neural patterns for somebody using their amputated limb for just a very basic motor task. And so we really enrolled a convenient sample of 5 persons with upper limb loss, all former right-handed with right limb loss. All of them, all but one, were transradial, one was transhumeral, and all of them used what is referred to as the body-powered split hook, which is a shoulder cable support that when you do that by scapular flexion, the hook on the end opens up. Only one of them had the more sophisticated I-limb technology out there. Interestingly enough, that one person only used their I-limb in reality to play pool billiards. And so that was always interesting to us, why he didn't use it, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We also looked at people that were either strongly left or strongly right-hand dominant doing the exact same task. So this is, again, just raise your arm, lift, point to a specific location, put it down. Very simple motor task. And so here's what we found. In right-hand dominant individuals, this is a pattern that's not surprising, most of the activity during the planning phase and leading into execution, when we look at that EEG activity that is projected now on the brain surface using source modeling, we were able to see that most of the activity is over the left premotor and motor areas. So that makes total sense. Good contralateral neurophysiology there for motor control. And also pretty expected. When right-handed people use their left arm, get bilateral activation. Not surprising at all. When left-handed individuals perform the task with their right hand, again, we see that bilateral activation. Not surprising. That's a very common pattern, seemingly in motor control. As well, when left-handed individuals use their left arm, you see a lot more right motor and sensory activity. Also fairly predictable. What really kind of shocked us and really kind of got us excited were 2 things about the amputees. One, when these formerly right-hand dominant amputees perform this task with their left arm, they have activation of their left arm that looks a lot more like left-hand dominant amputees. And so this was actually very interesting to us from a motor planning and motor control point of view, that their neurophysiology for motor control may have shifted to more of a left-handed individual. That has been one of those things that people have always asked about and wondered about in the literature. But as well, the amputees show a lot more diffuse activity and a lot more posterior and even into occipital and temporal areas. This has been shown by several other people as well over the recent years, suggesting that this is visual heightening of motor control and motor planning for these amputees. And so one of the things that we've been curious about and we're developing in the lab still, and I don't have time to share all of it with you today, certainly motor learning processes to support prosthesis use is very important. And I think it's also very critical to consider how we can actuate these prostheses with various sensory abilities to support usability and adaptation. But the question that we've been really thinking about is how we've been missing out on how the visual system, which is also a sensory system, might be able to support functional restoration, particularly in early amputation therapy. And we think what we're seeing with some of our research is that indeed we're able to do that. We're able to see people developing better motor patterns with their prosthetic limb when they're actually performing these actions with the assistance of somebody just like them using a prosthetic limb. And that this may be driven by visual feedback systems that are rather helpful. So just some brief concluding thoughts. While the sensory feedback from prostheses we think is very beneficial, at the end of the day, I'm not one to say that it's a fool's errand to try to create prosthetic limbs that have sensation. On the contrary, I actually think it's a tremendous opportunity. But we have this growing concern, at least in some of the work that we're doing and a few other people are doing, that it's not distinct enough from practice effects. And why is that? And secondly, there may be a role to improve prosthesis training if we focus on this kind of action observation model, and particularly when we're teaching limb prosthesis movement patterns. So again, using someone like you to learn these types of tasks. We think certainly that the visual gaze shows us that the visual system is heavily involved in this, and we're able to see some really good relationships between looking at certain parts of the body during this action observation training and how that infers to very specific motor benefits down the line. And we're just now looking at those particular aspects of the story. And I can't share that with you now. I would love to, but we still don't fully know all that data and how it's going to pan out. But one of the things that we think is going on is that it may leverage ongoing plasticity in the amputated limb that might reinforce this sensory motor integration through the visual system. So a lot of our future studies are really focused on that, trying to understand the relationship between action observation approach and neuroplasticity. Is this coincidental? Is this sort of a primed part of rehabilitation, a prime part of the neuroplasticity that we can harness if we do it appropriately? And so with that, I'll stop. I certainly want to thank all of the people that have funded, particularly this part of the research. And with that, feel free to reach out anytime. But with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wheaton. That was fantastic. I want to remind people that you can ask questions in the both in the question and answer section and in the chat section, and we'll pick those and put those in front of Dr. Wheaton and actually ask you to ask them out loud as well. I had a question for you, and so that you're taking advantage of this innate learning that is when people are seeing things visually, and I'm always trying to tie in again how if we were able to regenerate components of the limb, if we were able to regenerate both in the central nervous system for stroke, which I know you've done work on in the past as well, or the limb itself, do you think that tying into this visual system is critical? And maybe that's a softball, but I'd love your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. I actually love that question because it's something that has been running through my mind as well. I think, with some of this work, I would love to see over time really that consideration of how all these things come together. And the important part of that, I think, is that this is how the system works in the non-injured state anyway, right? We rely on vision, we rely on proprioception, we rely on all these structures already. The only thing that makes it unique in the amputated state is that the whole limb isn't there anymore. But if certain parts of it could be regenerated, really being able to use this vision to tie it back in and maybe to support learning, I think that's a really tremendous opportunity to really see rehabilitation, particularly in upper limb loss, and certainly in other cases as well, really take off. It's sort of that closing the loop idea here.
Great. And we have a question that Charlotte Caskey typed in, and Charlotte, I wonder if you'd want to turn on your camera and ask the question, or at least audio. You're still muted from what I can see.
Sorry, yeah, I hopped out of the meeting for a second, but yes, I'm back. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about in the presentation when you were showing the way that they were kind of compensating during the video and how you were showing, I think, some of the angle plots, but looking at I think mainly in the sagittal plane. And so I was curious what some of those plots maybe looked like in other planes and if you were able to see differences between like changes in other areas as well, and if that was kind of visually showing some of the compensation.
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually have done that work. One of the things, as you well point out, these initial videos, they all are kind of in the sagittal position. And what's interesting is that they highlight the elbow, right? The elbow is the most apparent thing you see there. And so what we've done in a couple of studies is we've kind of rotated these camera views. We've looked at it kind of from a head-on point of view. We've looked at it from an oblique point of view. And basically the results are very much the same. It really seems like the shoulder just has to compensate, particularly for rotation. There's just no other way to perform the task without that shoulder movement. But really learning how to place the elbow and how to move the elbow through time is of principal import here. So yeah, great question. I think that's something as well that I still want to continue as we look at this longitudinally, how different visual angles may reinforce better effects or others over time, and also the durability.
Great. We have and I want to remind people, if you ask questions and you're prompted, please turn your camera on. We have a question from Dr. Wittenberg. George, you're also muted there. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I just got allowed to talk, so I'll take advantage of this. So Louis, good to see you, even virtually, and great talk. So one question I have is whether the activation, the EEG activation that you showed for the amputee movement is more like, is it more like moving the left hand for right hand dominant, or is it really a sort of overflow pattern where, as you were showing, very dramatically, the movements, even for practiced users, is very effortful, and may require the activation of multiple motor and sensory areas, as we often seen in early motor task performance before learning happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly great to see you as well, George. I think you're really dead on to something that we have been thinking about as well. In either case, right, whether the amputee is moving their sound limb, so to speak, or their amputated limb, one of the things we're really trying to understand now is what is the kind of the range of that activation and how it changes, whether through the normal course of time, and as well through rehabilitation. Can we see any change in kind of the volume of activated cortex in that pre-movement period? So far, I will honestly tell you, that's been a big challenge for us. We really haven't been able to see any major effects of the amount of cortex active through any of our training paradigms that we've tried in amputees. Whether that means that's just kind of what it is, whether or not we just haven't been able to reduce kind of that overflow, so to speak, we don't know. But that's certainly something that we're looking at carefully.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We had a question from, and I'm using the username for Zoom, so I'm going to assume it's Dr. Brandfast. Camera and unmute.
Hi, yes, that is. I have a question. If there would be any benefit from adding a vibrotactile input on the intact side while you're adding the input on the amputated upper extremity. And would there be maybe a difference of how that could be taken advantage of, acute versus chronic?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, tremendous question. That is something we're actually doing. One of my colleagues in electrical engineering at Georgia Tech and we are working on that right now, really trying to understand, going back to that first point, the practice effects versus the vibrotactile effects. Is there just something, is there a kind of a magic formula, so to speak, of how to deliver that feedback to have maybe a higher improvement in motor control and performance? What becomes interesting, though, when we talk to a lot of the amputees that we have run through these studies, and this is a very common result, I think, across the board, we're certainly not unique in this, is people often develop a bit of feedback fatigue, all right? It's just unnatural, it's in weird places, the timing isn't quite right. And they still remember what it feels like to pick up something, right? They haven't forgotten that. And so the learning curve of that and the kind of sensitivity of that is something that definitely has to be studied. And there's some really tremendous groups that are looking at, the wear, the amount, the density of all this type of feedback to see if there's an optimal point in order to get maximal benefit.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we'll have one last question before having Lisa Walters. We're going to ask you to turn your camera on and unmute and ask a question. And while you're doing that, I just want to remind those people who are in the Meet the Mentor session to stay on after this last question, and we'll move into that session. Lisa, thank you for asking a question.
Hi, Dr. Wheaton. I don't know if you remember, we've corresponded on email, so it's great to actually sit in on this informational session. So my question was, obviously, since upper limb amputee patients are few and far between, and it sounds like you have a nice core group that you can kind of work with, how do you think it's possible with the teaching feedback of prosthetic movement could be useful through just a video, since there aren't necessarily, if I'm training somebody that has a transhumeral amputation, I may not have somebody immediately available with the same level and same type of device.
Yeah, great question, and great to see you here as well. I think absolutely, we've tested so far all of these using videos. I would love to actually do a comparison of video versus in person to see if it makes a difference. And the main reason why I've done videos is really for experimental reasons, right? It's the ability to standardize the actions and the timing and all that good stuff. But to really get into it deeper, when you actually put it, let's say, into a clinical environment, are there potential benefits to a more communicative delivery of this model in one group versus another? There's also the opportunity potentially for these kind of peer rehabilitative approaches to really bring two people together and that each literally share this amputation, right? So not modeling an amputation of therapist, but really bringing two people together. And there's a good bit of extra communication that can happen there beyond just here's how you pick up discs. That's nice, but that's not necessarily the goal of rehab, right? At the end of the day, you want them to do a lot more than that, but also develop confidence. And I think that there is a real benefit for that as well.
That's the one thing that we found when we wrote the DoD VA clinical practice guideline. That was the one thing we could state with evidence is the peer mentoring. So yeah. Exactly right.
Absolutely.
So great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Great to see you.